FCC, and happy Easter. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning, and Cody's going to begin service with this reading.
Let's pray together. God of power and might, you raised Jesus from the dead, just as you raised Israel out of Egypt. As we arise in the light of this new day, raise us to live by your power, the life that only you can give. Everyone said,
Amen.
Amen.
job. It don't pay your bills. It won't buy you a home in Beverly Hills. It won't fix your life.
So this is probably a different Easter than any of us have ever probably had. But we're so thankful and fortunate that there is still this way to gather as a community, especially on a day like today. So if you're watching and you're new, then please feel free to say hi or wave. Let us know you're here in the comments. And whenever you do watch this, for anyone who watches, please share the video so we can extend our reach out to more people as well. Okay, jumping into it because we have a lot to talk about this morning. This is the most exciting day of the year on the Christian calendar. And I know we often think of Christmas as sort of having that title and being sort of the most important Christian holiday. And I love Christmas, don't get me wrong, but it's Easter. Because just think about it. If you take the Christmas story out of the New Testament, what do you lose? You lose a couple of chapters in Matthew, you lose a couple of chapters in Luke, and that's it. If you take the Easter story out of the New Testament, well, you lose all the Gospels. You lose all the letters of Paul. You lose the early church fathers. You lose Christianity. Simply put, Easter is the foundation that Christianity is built upon. And so, for the last 4 weeks, we've been speaking about the creation stories in Genesis. And this morning, we're not going to depart from that, because the Easter story is going to be the culmination of that creation series. Because Easter is the ultimate creation story. It's the ultimate story of new creation. It is a new creation story. And so, what does the Easter story mean? It seems like a weird question to ask, because we're all pretty much, we know the gist of it, at least the main, the main event. But I think it's one of those instances where familiarity has kind of led us to unfamiliarity. We're so used to hearing the story, or again, like the main part of the story, that we shut ourselves off from looking into it further and exploring what the story means. We become so used to simply hearing it as a telling of events that happened in the past. For many of us, the Easter story has just become a telling of events. As Christians, followers of Jesus, or whatever phrase or label that you like to use, we make this claim that God has raised Jesus, that the tomb was empty. And then we kind of stop there with it. The conversation revolves around the happening of the event. We discuss what the resurrection may have looked like, or if it was spiritual, or if it was bodily, or if it happened at all. We wonder if we could set a camera up at the tomb of Jesus, just what that would look like. But the point is that we make Easter all about the claim. So here's a question. Let's say it happened. Let's just say that we all agree the resurrection happened. God raised Jesus. So what? I don't say that to be dismissive. I say that because that's the question that we should be asking. If God raised Jesus, what does that mean? What are the ramifications for that? Another way of asking that is, what do the resurrection stories in the Gospels mean? So let's put aside the debate about what that looked like, or if it was bodily or spiritual or whatever else that we like to debate one another about. And let's ask ourselves this question instead. Let's ask ourselves, what did the early Christians mean when they said God raised Jesus? Because whatever happened that Easter Sunday at the tomb, whatever it was significant enough that the early believers believed it unto their martyrdom. Whatever it was that morning that they experienced, they were willing to die for it. And many of them did. So, just like the creation stories in Genesis, or the flood story that we looked at last week, we can get roped into that conversation about what literally, really happened all those years ago. But the truth is that we weren't there. I don't know what it looks like when God raises somebody from the dead. None of us do. And so, what does that debate really do for us? I mean, how does that debate manifest itself in our lives today? I think the resurrection is completely transformative. Why? That's the question. What does it mean for us? And what does it mean for the world that Jesus was raised? Because the Easter story is more than just telling you about an event that happened 2,000 years ago. Because people don't speak about events that don't have ramifications. Let's talk about monsters. Just hear me out for a second. It'll tie in, I promise. In the Old Testament, there is a book called Daniel. And Daniel is the same genre of writing as the New Testament book, Revelation. So it has a lot of wild imagery in it. And there's a story in chapter 7 that speaks of all these monsters that are rising up out of the sea. And we know from looking back the past few weeks at the creation stories in Genesis that the sea or the waters represent chaos and disorder. Remember, God creates by bringing chaos or bringing order to chaos or function to brokenness by separating the waters from one another in both the Genesis story and the flood story. We actually also see this in the Exodus story as well, when God liberates Moses and the Israelites by what? By separating the chaotic waters of the Red Sea and destroying Pharaoh's army by allowing the chaotic waters to come collapsing back on themselves. It's sort of a mini throwback to the flood story. So, in the ancient world, water represented chaos and destruction. And it's not so hard to understand today because, the ocean or the seas are a sort of a chaotic place. Like, we can't tame the ocean. We're sort of at its mercy. And so I think that we can kind of see where they're coming from with this. And so in the book Daniel, you have monsters that are coming out of the sea. Or to think of it as another way, you have chaos giving birth to monsters that cause all this destruction and all this havoc. And you go on to read that these monsters represent different worldly empires, different systems of power that have used their power and authority to crush everyone underneath them. And then there's this character in the story that's called the Son of Man. And the Son of Man comes along and battles these monsters and wins. Battles these ruthless empires and comes out victorious and makes his own kingdom that lasts forever. It's a story about hope. It's a story about liberation. It's a story about a people under the subjugation of a ruthless empire that are desperately seeking liberation and freedom and an end to their persecution. It was their hope that someday, eventually, someone will come along and take on the empire and free them. And so in this story, liberation comes by the sword. There's another liberation story in the Old Testament book, Isaiah. And in this story, there's a character that is known as the suffering servant. And whomever it was that wrote the story in Isaiah, they had a very different outlook than whoever wrote Daniel for how liberation from their oppression would come about. Because in Daniel, it was because someone would rise up with the sword and lead a battle against the empire that's pressing down on them. But in Isaiah, it's because someone would come along and allow the empire, allow the systems of power and oppression and violence and evil to do the very worst to them, but not retaliate. By taking the worst that evil could possibly dish out and not returning it, not repaying violence with violence or evil with evil, this person then breaks the cycle of violence that the whole world is trapped in. This person brings justice not through retribution, but instead through restoration. These stories show that the ancient authors were hopeful for salvation. And for them, salvation meant something very literal. It meant liberation from their oppressors. It meant being delivered from their captivity and freed from their subjugation by other empires and to have their own kingdom where they can rule and govern themselves. So for them, salvation didn't conjure images of sitting on a cloud and playing a harp or however we sometimes think of that today. For them, salvation brought images of no longer being a slave, no longer having armies traipse through your villages. Their hope for salvation was something that was very much rooted in this world, in this reality. Their hope was salvation in liberation from their oppressors. The hope that someday their God will set them free, and the systems of unjust power and greed and violence will finally, at last, be dealt with. That their monsters will be defeated. And so they hoped for a Messiah, a Savior, to come and rescue them.
We sharpened the steel. We built up the wall. We hid all the answers so they could never fall. And then we boxed in the truth. We hid our slave. Choose who was worthy. The helpless away. We tried to put love in a cage, but it always finds a way to escape. And hallelujah, we're learning what it means to be free. Hallelujah, the table's made up for you and me. The kingdom is here. It's a kingdom of peace. Now we pull the line, just too scared to see. And hallelujah, it took us so long to be free. And then we wrote it all down in the black and the red, and decided what matters is where we go when we're dead. But what about this life? What about today? Are you afraid that tomorrow may run out of grace? 'Cause when we try to put love in a cage, it always finds a way to everybody. We hope you're singing along at home. This song is called Always. This is the start. This is your heart. This is the day you were born. This is the song. Brings out your lungs. This is the day you were born. And I'm always yours. And I'm always
And that rescue and the life that will be lived after that rescue would be a new way of life. You could say that it would be the beginning of a new age for them. And that's what they meant when the New Testament writers would speak of the age to come. It would be a new way of being for them. It would be a new life in a new creation. So Jesus comes along, and one of the things that he does is that he takes these two figures that we've just talked about, the Son of Man figure in Daniel, and the suffering servant figure in Isaiah. And he not only weaves the two figures together into one, but he identifies himself as that figure. We see that Jesus identifies as both the Son of Man and the suffering servant. We see in Isaiah that Israel, or the people of Israel, collectively identified themselves as this suffering servant, that somehow, through their oppression and suffering, will come not only their liberation, but the liberation for the whole world. And so Jesus symbolically becomes the embodiment of Israel. He symbolically becomes Israel. Just think how Israel passes through the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. And then Israel wanders the desert for 40 years. And so Jesus wanders the desert for 40 nights. Israel consisted of 12 tribes or 12 families. And so Jesus takes on 12 disciples. And just as Israel suffered from the oppression and violence of an empire, Jesus will as well. Jesus' preferred title for himself was the Son of Man. This is a direct reference to the character that overtakes the monsters in Daniel. It's a very political label that he takes on for himself. Taking on that label, the label of the character that overtakes the empire, it's just like placing a target right on your back. And so when Jesus is on trial and he's asked, "Are you the Messiah?" which is a way of asking, so you're the one who's supposed to bring liberation? And Jesus answers yes. But he answers yes by quoting from the story in Daniel, "You will see me coming with the clouds of heaven," which is what is said in Daniel after the Son of Man wins against the monsters, wins against the empires. Jesus is claiming victory here, saying that it's through his movement and his way of being in the world that's going to free it, that's going to win out and triumph over the empires and over the systems of violence and oppression that those empires stand for. What makes this story all the more confusing then is when Jesus dies. What about defeating the systems of violence and oppression and evil? What about the Son of Man in Daniel that's victorious and frees everyone and brings in his own kingdom? It seems as if the systems of power and evil win out. What kind of Messiah takes on evil and loses? Well, no kind of Messiah. The Messiah isn't supposed to lose because the Messiah is not supposed to die. How do you know if you picked the wrong guy as your Messiah? The empire executes him. That's how you knew. We've seen this throughout history with other supposed would-be messiahs. They get a following just like Jesus, and they create a movement, and then the empire kills the leader and the movement goes away forever. Jesus' crucifixion, on one hand, was nothing special. Lots of people have been crucified. Lots of people have been executed as an enemy of the state. Jesus is but one of thousands. His story should have ended there. And yet, here we are.
Jealous for me. Love's like a hurricane, and I am a tree. I'm bending beneath weight of his wind and mercy. All of a sudden, I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory. And I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. Know how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. Now he is jealous for me. He loves like a hurricane, and I am a tree. I'm bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. When all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory. I realize just how beautiful you are and how great your affections are for me. Oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. And he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. And we are his portion, and he is our prize. Drawn to redemption by the grace in his eyes. With grace is an ocean we're all singing. So heaven meets earth like a sloppy wet kiss, and my heart beats violently inside of my chest. 'Cause I don't have time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way. Oh, how he loves us so. Oh, how he loves us. How he loves us so. And he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. He loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves us. Oh, how God bless our friends. God bless our enemies.
rather than Jesus' movement disbanding and fading into history, soon to be forgotten, just like all the other would-be messiahs, Jesus' movement persisted even after his death. Because, unlike those other messiahs, Jesus' followers claimed that God raised Jesus. Whatever the resurrection event literally was, it means that God vindicated Jesus and his movement. Jesus has 2 trials, and he's put to death. And so it seems like he's found guilty, and that death and evil win. But God raises Jesus to say, no, Jesus was actually in the right, that his movement and his way of being in the world is found to be in the right. And although it looked like death and evil and violence and oppression win, in the end, those things actually don't have the final say in the story. The systems of evil and injustice do actually get defeated. They've done their worst to Jesus. And although it looked like they won, God raises Jesus and it breaks the cycles of violence, defeating the systems of power and evil and liberating everyone and everything from their grip. In the end of the story, love wins. Jesus' way of being human in the world, the way of servanthood and love and compassion, defeat the ways of the empire. And so, we are given that ultimate new creation story. The new creation story begins with an empty tomb, and it continues on as we live our lives today. I love how the Gospel of John actually tells the story and highlights the parallels between Jesus' creation story and the creation story in Genesis. The writer of John begins his gospel with the opening words, "In the beginning." It's an obvious throwback to Genesis 1:1. John is setting up from the very beginning a new creation story. In the Genesis creation story, on the 6th day, the Friday, God creates humankind. Like here are the ones that most reflect my image out into the world. And then in John chapter 19, Pontius Pilate presents Jesus to the crowd. And we're told that, so Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." Gospel of John was originally written in Greek, and the Greek there is literally, "Behold the man." God's image bearers are presented to us on the 6th day in Genesis, just as God's ultimate image bearer is presented to the crowd on the 6th day in John. And then, once Jesus has been crucified, we're told in chapter 20, when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. The work was completed. Just like we're told all of God's creative work had been finished at the end of the creation story, and then God rested from all that work on the 7th day, just like Jesus rested in the tomb on the 7th day. And then we're told not only once, but twice, that on a new day of the new week, Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb, and then the whole thing begins anew. Easter Sunday is the first day of the new creation. We don't really know the first date of that very first Easter Sunday. The early church leaders, they chose the first Sunday after the first full moon of the spring equinox. And we understand that spring represents rebirth of life, that the plants that seem dead in winter are now springing forth back to life. Easter is new creation. That's what the Easter story is all about. Easter is liberation, Easter is hope. Easter is the defeat of evil with the power of love. It's restorative justice. But Easter is also a call to action. Again, in the Genesis story, we see God breathe divine breath into the humans that God created, and those humans become fully alive and then given responsibility to care for the garden. And then again in John, we see that Jesus does the same thing. He breathes divine breath into his disciples, and he tells them, "Peace be with you. As the Father sent me, so I send you." We see that both in Genesis and in John, humans receive divine breath to become fully alive and then work towards fulfilling God's new creation. God began something anew when Jesus came out of the tomb. Resurrection means that we have work to do. So we can put aside the debate about what the literal event looked like. Because what's important is not the empty tomb. What's important is the risen Christ. Our task is to embody the resurrection. Because that's where we meet the risen Christ in the world. And I believe that we embody the resurrection and we meet the risen Christ when we pray and when we worship and when we celebrate communion, sure. But we also meet the risen Christ in the faces of the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized, the people in need. These are the places where heaven and earth overlap. Resurrection means that what you do in the present is not wasted in the future. N.T. Wright says that you're not oiling the wheels of a machine that's just going to fall off the edge of a cliff one day. So when you feed the hungry, when you house the homeless, these things may seem as though they're just random acts of kindness. But the gospel stories, they tell us that these are some of the ways that we embody the risen Christ. It is our job to put into effect or to carry out the resurrection of Christ into all of God's creation. When Jesus is on the cross and he says, "It is finished," the Greek word there is tetelestai. And I won't get too lost in the weeds with the Greek grammar, but Greek words can do some things that English words can't. And so tetelestai means it is finished, but it also means that there are ramifications for that in the future. Resurrection means that we have work to do. We have to play our part in partnering with God into fully bringing in this new creation. So Easter isn't just a commemoration of something that happened 2,000 years ago, but it's something that happens now. It's something that happens every single day in every single one of us if we play our part in it. May the peace of Christ go with you wherever he may send you. May he guide you through the wilderness, protect you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. So let's stop worrying about what the resurrection may have looked like 2,000 years ago. And let's start seeing what the resurrection looks like today.